So CRISPR is not the only biotech process that's important. Biotechnology has been used to increase food nutrition and to make farming more efficient and eco-friendly as well. So let's talk about how we genetically engineer food. So genetic engineering is the manipulation of a species genome, and it's manipulation in a way that doesn't occur naturally in nature. Now, genomes do change over time through the process of natural selection. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester. But for hundreds, even thousands of years, people have been doing genetic engineering through a process of artificial selection. So basically, farmers and agriculturalists have been breeding plants for specific traits for a long, long time. And we have gotten many of our modern crops, farm animals, things like that, dogs, cats, through this process of artificial selection where we select for desirable traits. So we've been doing that for a long time, but recombinant DNA technology has enabled us to speed up that process where we take the genes that encode specific traits that we want from one organism and put it into another. So the result is a more desirable agricultural product. So for example, modern corn is much larger. It has larger, juicier kernels. It's often more pest and disease tolerant than ancestral varieties because we have been able to introduce new genes into the corn genome. So let's talk about another example of a genetically modified food. So this example is golden rice. So golden rice has been genetically engineered to contain vitamin A. And the reason this was done is that 10% of the world's population suffers from a vitamin A deficiency. This causes blindness in 250,000 children a year and other illnesses in people throughout the world. Vitamin A deficiency is especially severe in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, where rice is a staple in most diets. So in an attempt to address this concern, beta carotene, which is a precursor, it's used by the body to produce vitamin A, which is produced naturally in other organisms, the gene was isolated and inserted into the white rice genome. So remember, we have to chop out the gene that we want. So the two genes were taken from the daffodil and another gene was taken from a bacterium and inserted into the white rice genome. And then this golden rice actually has this pretty yellow color because of the beta carotene. The beta carotene is what makes carrots, I almost said purple, makes carrots orange. And so that's why this rice is called golden rice. So this white rice that has been engineered to contain beta carotene actually has a 25-fold increase in vitamin A content compared to white rice. This was developed in 1999 with the hopes that it would improve food nutrition throughout the world. Field tests are still in progress. There are a lot of biosafety protocols and regulations that prevent cultivation outside of large commercial farms. But because of the potential of this, there's a lot of push to get this to be more common. Now, there's a lot of opposition to genetically modified organisms, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But no matter how you feel about it, more than 170 million acres worldwide are planted with genetically modified crops. Most of this modification is to include insecticides or to include herbicide resistance. And so in the United States, genetically modified crops are very, very common. You can see down here on the bottom that 86% of the corn in the United States is genetically modified. Only 14% is not. Same thing with cotton and soybeans. 93% of each of those are genetically modified crops. So there are two reasons that farmers have adopted these modified crops. One is that you can engineer insecticides into them, which allows them to have resistance to pest insects. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then the other reason is that you can engineer herbicide resistance. This allows you to spray herbicides on your crops to kill weeds, but not the crop that you're trying to grow. So you can imagine that this is economically important for farmers because they aren't losing their crops to insects, to weeds, or to the herbicides that they are spraying on those weeds. So insect resistance, a perfect example is BT corn. You may or may not have heard of this. I had heard of this, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, I would never say this right, thuringiensis, you could just call it BT, actually produces a chemical that kills insects. But this chemical doesn't harm humans. And so the gene from the bacteria containing the the sequence from the bacteria containing the BT crystal gene was chopped out, amplified, and inserted into the corn genome. So this is helpful because these little butterfly larvae can get in and eat the corn, but when they eat the corn with the BT gene in it, then those butterfly larvae are killed. So you are reducing the insect predation on your crops. The other thing that's helpful here is you no longer have to spray pesticides on your crops. So this reduces the cost for the pesticides, and it also reduces the amount of pesticides that are being sprayed in an environment, because a lot of those pesticides are going straight into the soil, and so you're not necessarily using them effectively. Plus, these BT crystals are targeted for the insect that is their pest. Now, there's a flip side to this. What if these BT crystals get out and start killing butterfly populations somewhere else? So there's a plus and a minus to all of this genetic engineering. We can also make genetically modified animals. So an example here is this salmon. So this salmon has been modified to using a growth hormone gene that keeps it growing longer, and so that genetically modified salmon is much, much bigger than the naturally occurring salmon. So the USDA is close to approving human consumption, of this Atlantic salmon. If they do, it will be the first approved genetically modified animal for human consumption. So this modified Atlantic salmon carries a growth hormone gene from a different salmon species, the Chinook salmon, along with a different fish species called an ocean pout that is actually sort of an on switch for that that growth hormone factor. So this guy actually has two different genes, one for the growth factor to make it bigger and one to turn on that growth factor. So to sort of control the growth factor. So the FDA has reported that this transgenic salmon is safe, just as safe to eat as other Atlantic salmon, but there's some opposition. So some people express concerns about safety and environmental issues. And also health concerns about consuming salmon that have potentially higher growth hormones present in the fish. There's potential to increase allergic reaction rates. And then there's also the probability of these escaped fish. So if these larger fish escape, you're going to have ecological problems where these fish are out competing smaller natural populations. And so this is one of those sort of unintended consequences. You don't know what might actually happen if these fish get out into the wild, and you don't know necessarily the effects of that growth hormone on the population. This food biotechnology is also used in herbicide resistance. So genes are inserted into a particular crop that allows it to be resistant to herbicides that are applied to the field. So those herbicides can kill the weeds but not affect the crop that you're trying to grow. This began in the 1990s when researchers discovered a bacterial gene that actually confers herbicide resistance. So your crop is grown with that gene for herbicide resistance, but the weeds surrounding it are not. So you can spray them with the herbicide and not affect your crop population. So biotechnology has a lot of pros and cons. Biotechnology has led to some important improvements in agriculture, and it has also reduced the environmental and financial costs for farmers of producing that food. But as I've already mentioned, there are potentially some risks to these genetically modified foods. So most of these I've actually probably mentioned as we've been going along, but we'll get them here in a few slides just to make sure that I've got them all. So the potential ecological and health risks of transgenic species is not yet fully understood. This is generally a new field, and so we don't yet know all of the ramifications of actually using transgenic species. There are definitely some benefits that we've already seen, but not all of the risks are actually known yet. One of the potential ecological problems, or just sort of maybe failed attempts at modifying an organism, is this featherless chicken. So this guy's kind of funny looking. You can see he has no feathers on his little body. This guy actually wasn't made using biotechnology. He was actually he was actually bred to not have any feathers. And the reason that they wanted to have these naked chickens is that preparing them for market was much cheaper if they didn't have to defeather the chickens. And so the process, the whole process of raising and slaughtering the chickens was much quicker. But it turns out that these featherless chickens are vulnerable to mosquito attacks, parasites, disease, and are ultra sensitive to sunlight, all of the things that those feathers would be protecting those chickens from. They also had difficulty mating because the males need to flap their wings, and if they have no feathers on their wings to flap during their mating, then they cannot make baby chickens. So these chickens are sort of an important lesson in that you don't always know the consequences of your technology pursuits. And they also illustrate sort of the unintended consequences. So they ended up having although they had the desirable trait, the one that they were looking for, they also had a lot of unintended and undesirable traits. And so we can imagine that doing this using biotechnology can also produce those unintended and undesirable traits as well. So these unknown, unintended traits could potentially be harmful. They may not be, but there's not really much way of knowing until there's more studies done on some of these modified organisms. So those featherless chickens demonstrate that some risks of unintended and potentially harmful traits can occur, and those risks need to be weighed. And so for those reasons and some other reasons that we'll talk about in a minute, many people have concerns about producing and consuming genetically modified foods. Now, some of those concerns are legitimate and rational. Others are maybe a little bit less so. So let's talk about some of the concerns surrounding genetically modified organisms. So one, organisms that we want to kill may become invincible. So if you are introducing an herbicide resistant plant into an environment, there's the potential that it could move out of the agriculture area you're in. So for example, weed resistant canola plants in Canada make it possible to grow the canola and spray for weed killer. But in this case, some of that weed resistant canola plant accidentally spread into other farms where they weren't wanted, and then began to grow out of control because traditional herbicides couldn't kill them. So again, there's the potential of these plants or even animals escaping containment and causing problems in other areas. So sort of the flip side of that is organisms that we don't want to kill might be killed inadvertently. So if you think about that BT crystal corn example with the monarch butterfly larva. It is designed to kill butterflies, kill the larvae so that they don't attack the crop plants, but that could have a greater effect on the ecosystem. If you're killing butterflies, which are important in pollination, you might affect the surrounding ecosystem. And then there was also a study that showed that if pollen from those BT corn got on other plants outside of the field, that they could actually kill monarch butterfly larvae there where they don't need to be killed. So that hasn't actually happened. That was a research project, but there is, of course, the potential of that, and you could not necessarily control the movement of pollen off of those corn plants. And you might end up killing monarch butterflies on other plants where they're supposed to be. Genetically modified crops are not tested or regulated adequately. So using genetically modified foods or other organisms is a relatively new technology. Scientists have been working towards getting an organized and responsible set of policies to ensure sufficient safety testing is done. But at the moment, there are not a lot of guidelines or government regulations, and it's sort of up to the company to ensure that they are testing correctly. So Monsanto is a good example. That's a company here in St. Louis. They have a strain of herbicide-resistant soybeans that has been evaluated and approved by 31 different regulatory agencies in 17 countries. So those soybeans have gone through rigorous testing to make sure that they're safe. But the problem is that some companies don't test adequately, or they simply don't know what they need to be testing for because they don't know the risks or potential problems yet. And the US National Academy of Sciences has warned that these bioengineered organisms might pose risks that the government cannot evaluate, either because they don't know the risks or they have no way to evaluate those risks. And because technology is changing so quickly, it's difficult to know what new risks might come up. All right, next concern, eating genetically modified food could be dangerous. So an example here, in the 1990s, a gene from Brazil nuts was used to improve the nutritional content of soybeans. However, those modified soybeans also acquired some allergy-causing chemicals that were present in Brazil nuts, but not the soybeans. So if you have an allergy to Brazil nuts and you unknowingly eat these soybeans, you could potentially have an allergic reaction. So far, though, so that sort of demonstrates that you can have unwanted features pass between, and those unwanted features are potentially unrecognized until they actually occur. To date, there's no strong evidence that actually suggests that genetically modified foods is dangerous. There might be some unwanted consequences, like in the Brazil nut with the allergies, but in general, it seems that genetically modified foods are actually no different as far as being safe to consume compared to their natural counterparts. Loss of genetic diversity among crop plants is risky. This is a big concern because genetic diversity in a population is really important. It allows a population, whatever it might be, plant, animal, or otherwise, to change, for the population to change as needed due to environmental responses. And if you are favoring genetically modified crops, one or more strains, you're going to lose diversity in the crops that you have. Now, the flip side of this is that you're going to reduce the number of varieties of a particular food item you have. You could potentially reduce, say, the nutritional variety of the types of crop plants you have. Then we have hidden costs that might reduce financial advantages of the genetically modified crops. So we saw some positives here. If you can use crops that are resistant to herbicide, resistant to insecticide, you're not going to lose as much of your crop. And in the long run, that's probably going to be beneficial to the people whose lives depend on the income from those crops. But there are potentially hidden costs. So one way to reduce the potential of these genetically modified organisms from spreading is to make them unable to propagate on their own. Basically, make them unable to pollinate or produce seeds on their own. And so this requires farmers to buy new seeds every year because you cannot harvest your own seeds from the previous crop. So this might increase long-term costs. It might increase dependency on seed companies, and therefore incur some additional costs. Also, these seeds are expensive, and so there's an additional cost there. Finally, they aren't natural. I sort of added this one in from our book doesn't list this as a specific concern, but this is one that I've heard. Well, it's just not natural. You shouldn't be eating that gene or eating an organism that's not natural. And this is obviously something people are going to have all of these are things that people are going to have personal opinions on. But my sort of argument here is there are a lot of things that we put into our bodies that are not natural. So, vaccines, medications, things like that. And just because they aren't natural doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't study them and regulate them. But by simply being not natural doesn't necessarily devalue them or make them harmful. So, are genetically modified organisms safe? Should we be consuming them? Well, the answer is nobody really knows. It's difficult to prove that something is not dangerous because you cannot prove in all situations at all times that something is safe. There are a lot of issues on the safety of foods that have been debated, but many organizations like the World Health Organization and the American Medical Association have said that in general, GMO foods are no more risky than non-GMO foods.